Last year, I managed to rank 4th out of 157 Cambridge economics students with my end-of-year essay on the Industrial Revolution, and in this video, I'm going to tell you how I did it. To provide some context, at the end of the previous academic year, I was set the task of writing a 2,500-word response to an essay question about the British Industrial Revolution. I had 4 days to read, plan, write and edit my response, as did the other 156 students in my year. So let's begin with the first step, which is reading. So a lot of the time with your actual exam essay questions, students aren't given reading lists. And as time is of the essence, you want to know which readings will be the most useful, as this way the time you spend reading is as effective as possible. But on the other hand, you don't want to spend ages looking for the readings, as this has a big opportunity cost. You don't want to waste time looking for readings when you could be doing something else. So I guess the first step before you actually start the reading is getting the reading list you want to read from in the first place. And here are some things that may help. 1. Use Google. Look up readings about the specific questions at hand. Usually you'll find a decent list of readings that apply to the topic or subject area at hand. Another thing you could do is use ChatGPT. Maybe enter a prompt like, generate a reading list for this exam question, and see what it gets out. It may be that the readings you get from this are a bit more focused than if you were to look them up on the internet instead. Something to note about your reading though is that you can always come back to it. So what I did is I did the reading for my original reading list, but I also came back to do extra reading when I realised there were gaps in my knowledge when it came to the planning process. As a brief sort of side note, I'd recommend not viewing the essay process as a rigid structure of read, then plan, then write, then edit. Sections can kind of be intertwined, so don't worry if when you get to the planning section, you realise you have to do a little bit more reading. That's okay. It can very much be the case that you think you've done a reading, but when you come to planning your essay, you realise there's a slight gap, and you have to go back and do a little bit more reading. But using Google or some sort of AI to help generate that reading list in the first place can be really useful. So the first step is finding the stuff you're going to read. The second step is actually doing the reading. Now, I am not a great reader. It's definitely one of my academic weaknesses. I'm not a very fast reader, and also I'm not a very focused reader. But with that being said, these are the things that help me become the most efficient reader possible for this essay task. So the first thing is be interested in what you're reading. It's actually crazy the potential effect that a simple mindset shift can have on the whole reading process. It's easier said than done, but if you can convince yourself that the readings you're doing and the essay question at hand is really interesting, then it makes the whole reading process much more focused. For me, in this situation, I knew I had the next 4 days solely dedicated, apart from eating and sleeping, to this essay question. So I may as well try and enjoy it and be interested in it as much as possible. The second thing that can help is be willing to skim until you find what you're looking for. People often fall into the trap of reading everything really deeply, even if it doesn't even relate to the question topic at hand. For those online readings, Control F can become your best friend. If you've got a massive reading in front of you, there's no point reading the whole thing just to try and find the specific thing you're looking for. Instead, Control F for a keyword that relates to the specific thing you're looking for and go from there. What's more, introductions and conclusions to chapters can be very useful as well. Assuming they're well written, introductions and conclusions should basically summarize everything that's talked about in that chapter, and thus it should hopefully let you know if the specific thing you're looking for will crop up in that chapter. So we've generated our reading list and we've begun reading, and hopefully the reading we're doing is as focused and efficient as possible. But note that the physical act of reading is only really half of this reading section. There's also the note-taking you need to do whilst reading. I personally believe that efficient and effective note-taking is a really difficult skill, and it's definitely one I'm yet to master. And what makes it really difficult is trying to strike that balance between quantity and precision. What I mean by this is you don't want to take loads and loads of notes, but only a small proportion actually directly relates to the question topic and essay at hand. If you do this, all you're left with is pages upon pages of notes, which are difficult to digest and aren't directly helpful. On the other hand, you don't want to be such a cautious note taker that by the end of a reading, all you've got are a few sentences and insufficient quotes, so much so that you may as well have not done a reading in the first place. So there's a balance that you really want to strike, and again, these are the things that help me try at least get close to striking that balance. So the first thing is having at least a brief idea of what your argument will be before you start the reading. This way, it becomes much easier to only take notes which are relevant to your specific answer and your specific essay question. But I guess this begs the question of, well, how do you know where your argument will be before you even start the reading? I want to emphasize, you don't have to have your full argument thought out before you start the reading, but a brief idea of what your argument may be can be useful. Looking at the specific words of the question, what the question's really asking, your prior knowledge can all be helpful in at least shaping the skeleton of your argument. The second thing which can be useful is underlining or bolding your important notes. So maybe you've just read something that you are certain will be useful for your essay. When you take this note, underline or bold it. Now say you just read something else, but you're unsure if it will be of use to your essay. Still take the note on it, but don't do anything special to it, just leave it as normal text. This way, when you come back to look at your notes again, you can clearly see the important information and the less important information. But it also ensures that you still capture all the information which you may need to use. Hopefully this way your notes are easy to digest, but also you don't miss out any information which you wish you had taken a note on earlier. Right, so now we generated our reading list, we've done the reading, and we've done efficient note taking. The next stage is planning. Just remember, there may be additional reading we need to go back to if we realise there are some gaps in our essay plan when we come round to it. So what I found really useful when I was planning this particular essay was splitting the plans down into separate documents. So I had one document for the introduction plan, one for the point 1 plan, one for the point 2 plan, etc, etc. I personally believe this made the whole planning process much more manageable. Now, something that can be really difficult in the planning process is making sure you're only planning and not actually writing. Plans are not the place for nice sentence structure or perfect prose. Instead, they're a place for clearly outlining your paragraph structure, what your arguments will be, and what readings you'll be referring to. Something that a professor here at Cambridge told me in an essay writing workshop was never plan in full sentences. This way, it ensured you were actually sticking to planning in the actual plan, rather than doing writing in the plan. Another big issue that can come up in the planning section of a whole essay is how do you know when you'll finish your plan? Well, you know because you should be able to look at your essay and have a crystal clear idea of what your argument will be and what your essay will look like. If you think you finished your plan, but you look at it and you don't actually really know what your big argument will be or what your conclusion will look like, you are yet to finish your plan. Sometimes it seems like the planning process can drag on for a while, but trust me, do not start writing until you have completely finished your plan. Otherwise, you run the massive risk of writing, realizing you don't actually believe your argument halfway through and you want to argue something different, and then you just wasted all that writing time. But once your plan is finished, i.e. you know what your argument will be, you know what each paragraph will look like, then it's time to begin writing. So let's start by talking about the introduction of your essay. Now, I personally believe that a really good introduction is something which is very difficult. And the reason I say that is because I think it's so easy to fall into the trap of doing a basic definition, some basic stats, and then just basically saying what your argument will be. Now, this isn't a bad introduction, but it's not a really good introduction either. For example, imagine the essay question, was the Enlightenment the main cause of the British Industrial Revolution? Now, one of these standard, not so great introductions would look something like this. The Industrial Revolution was a period of major mechanisation and innovation that began in Great Britain during the mid-18th century and early 19th century, and later spread throughout much of the world. The British Industrial Revolution was dominated by the exploitation of coal and iron. I believe the Enlightenment was the main cause of the British Industrial Revolution because it caused the institutional shift required for sustained growth and provided the incentive to invent. Now again, this isn't a bad introduction, but it's not at all nuanced, and it doesn't really offer much substance. So how can we improve this introduction? Well, let's start by talking about definitions. Don't just use dictionary definitions. Really think about what definitions you will use for different terms and why you will use said definitions. Ultimately, definitions shape what an essay will look like and ultimately shape what conclusions we achieve. Sticking with the same example, two different definitions of British Industrial Revolution could result in two different conclusions about whether the same Enlightenment was a primary cause or whether it wasn't. And now the argument. So you want your argument to be clear in your introduction. You want your introduction to essentially say what your essay will be about and what you'll talk about. Now, for big essays, you might have to justify why you're talking about what you're talking about, but essentially you want your argument to be clear and you also want your argument to be set up well in your introduction. Now, for this specific essay I'm talking about, my introduction was basically 3 paragraphs long and was over a page. And the question I was faced with is very similar to the one I just outlined there with the Enlightenment example. Now, I don't want to say that my introduction was perfect because looking back at it now, it's definitely not. But it's a better introduction than that simple one I gave earlier, and hopefully you can see it's much more nuanced and I'm justifying and carefully picking out what definitions I'm using. A French movement where reason was used to achieve freedom and progress, and during which hostility to religion was omnipresent, is Gay's definition of the Enlightenment. Alternatively, Kant believed the Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. However, he did not believe the 1700s had enough reason to be described as an enlightened age, rather it was an age of enlightenment. Mockier himself views the Enlightenment as the branch of the general scientific awakening concerned with applying reason and observation to improving the human condition. The key denominator to all these definitions is the view that the Enlightenment is a dynamic rather than a static term. Combining these definitions, the Enlightenment can be viewed as a shifting of mindset, characterized by 1, nature is driven by reason, and 2, progress is both possible and desirable. So this first bit of my introduction is all about the definition of the word enlightenment. As you can hopefully see, I've tried to carefully define this and justify my definition. Continuing on. Evaluation of the Enlightenment's centrality to the British Industrial Revolution is dependent on clear definitions for both central cause and British Industrial Revolution. Moreover, the definitions must be such that they do not contradict the statement presented in the question, as Mockyer does credit other causes for the British Industrial Revolution. Many definitions of the British Industrial Revolution exist: the development of mass production, the movement to an industry-dominated economy, the increase in standard of living, etc. Each definition could yield a unique conclusion. However, these definitions are all endogenous to changes in technology. To encompass the array of definitions, here the British Industrial Revolution will be defined as the sustained growth of British technological capabilities. The central cause is a cause which, if it had not occurred or existed, would have reduced the level of the British Industrial Revolution the most. Therefore, the central cause is the factor which contributed the most to the sustained growth of British technological capabilities. Vitally, these definitions enable the thesis to hold true from Mockyer's perspective, as he believed the Enlightenment was the difference between sustained growth and just another episode that would have tapered off to the steady state. Now, in this part of my introduction, I'm clearly defining what I mean by British Industrial Revolution and central cause. Hopefully, again, you can see that I've clearly thought about what definitions I'll use and justified why I'm using these definitions. Now moving on to the final part of my introduction. Criticism of the Enlightenment as the central cause of the British Industrial Revolution is often based on static and narrow definitions of the Enlightenment and fails to capture the Enlightenment's spillover effects. Once the Enlightenment is defined broadly and dynamically, it clearly underpins Britain's acquisition of useful knowledge, along with Britain's institutional change, which combine to facilitate the sustained growth of British technology capabilities, the British Industrial Revolution. Here, I've clearly thought about my definitions, I've justified my definitions, and I've clearly outlined my argument in a nuanced way. I cannot overstate the importance of a good introduction. It's the first thing the examiner will read, and it really sets the tone for the rest of your essay. So now we've got our introduction out of the way, let's move on to the main body of our essay. Now hopefully the writing stage shouldn't be that difficult if you've done a good plan in the first place. Key tips to remember when you're writing your main body though, is just make sure your argument flows like a spine throughout. I.e., in every paragraph you can clearly see what you're arguing and what point you're trying to make. Another thing to make sure is that you're using distinct paragraphs when you're making different points, so it clearly splits up the essay into a nice manageable read. And then after we've completed the main body of our essays, we're left with the conclusion. Now the conclusion should go hand in hand with the introduction, but should not be a carbon copy. Now, different people go about conclusions differently, but I'm just going to talk about the way I structure mine. So what I view a conclusion as is a good summary of the essay and a justification about why the argument you outlined in the introduction is in fact the correct argument. Obviously in your conclusion you don't want to bring in any new points, but you do want to talk about the points you've outlined in your essay. Essentially, it should be seen as a summary of all the reasons why your argument outlined in the introduction is in fact correct. So again, to provide an example, I'll read my conclusion from this essay. On the eve of, and throughout, the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment was a central cause to Britain's acquisition and diffusion of knowledge. It can be argued, as Allen attempts to, that the Enlightenment did not necessarily lead to the high rate of invention and innovation in British industries, and thus was not the driver of industrial growth. However, once a true, dynamic definition of Enlightenment is employed, and spillover effects are considered, the Enlightenment's role in Britain's technological progress is strikingly clear. Furthermore, this is confirmed by the statistical analysis of Gallifrey-Wheeler and Simon and Sullivan, distinctly showing how knowledge acquisition and diffusion resulted in higher rates of invention. It then seems as if institutional change reckons with the Enlightenment for the crown of central cause, since institutional change was imperative for Britain's sustained improvement in its technological capabilities. However, when examined deeper, the Enlightenment is revealed as the backbone of institutional change. Ultimately, the sustained growth of British technological capabilities was a result of progress, predominantly the progress of knowledge, but also the progress of institutions, agriculture, skills, etc. Fundamentally, progress can only occur if there is a desire for and belief in progress. In this sense, the Enlightenment can be viewed as a cause of causes. In the same way that humans' greatest invention was the invention of invention itself, humans' greatest progress is the progress of progress itself. Therefore, it can be concluded that the Enlightenment was the central cause of the British Industrial Revolution. Now again, I want to emphasise this is far from a perfect conclusion. I don't really know if I like what I was saying about the progress thing. I think it was a good point, but I could have executed it much better. But again, hopefully you can see this goes hand in hand with my introduction, but rather than being a carbon copy, it's more of a justification of the argument that I outlined in my introduction. Okay, so now we've completed our reading, we've done our plan, and we've finished writing. The final stage is editing. And there's 4 things I want to talk about in this whole editing stage. So the first thing is use a thesaurus. If you think that something you've written can be phrased better, chances are it can. And when you have these sort of take-home essays, there's no reason why your final result shouldn't be phrased as best possible. The second thing is be concise. When writing an essay, you never want to be in a position where you feel like you need to bulk it out. This is probably an indication that there's not enough depth or substance from your plan. Instead, it's probably a good sign if you're in a position where you need to cut things down for your essay, because at least this is a sign there's a good amount of depth to your essay. The professors marking these essays will be able to see straight through it if you're trying to bulk out this essay, because I realise there's a lot of words for very few actual points. Also, it's much easier when they're marking it if you can outline a point in this many words rather than this many. The third thing to consider when editing is make sure you're not being repetitive. Now, being repetitive is something I really struggle with in my writing. For example, I'd always say also or this means that, but when I read back through my essay, it would look very repetitive and not a very interesting read for whoever's marking it. I guess this links to the first point of using a thesaurus. And then the fourth thing to ensure when editing is make sure that your argument is like a spine throughout your essay. You can think of it as if your essay is sort of like a tree. So you have your main trunk, which is the argument, and you branch off a little bit to talk about what people said or particular readings, but everything should come back to this trunk. Essentially, you don't want to venture too far off this trunk where the things you're talking about don't really relate to your main argument whatsoever. And after we finish the editing process, hopefully we finish our essay. We've done the reading, we've done a good plan, we've written it and we've edited it, and now you should be left with a great essay in front of you. If you've got this far in the video, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and hopefully found it a bit useful or insightful. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. Again, thank you for watching and I'll see you soon.